Hi, welcome to Depot. Hello to everybody who's watching online. So some people there. It's a very nice occasion. It's Crit Cross, and great to have you back. It's a long partnership, and Roseanne Gush has been here a few weeks ago to present her book, so nice to have you back too. And we welcome Frida Sandström for the first time at Depot, and very excited presentation. I just want to say that we record this event, so if you speak into the microphone later, your voice will be recorded, but only the podium will be filmed. Thanks a lot to Jelena Kalderovic, Verein K, thanks for the organization, and would you like to say a few words?
Thank you. Hi. I would also like to greet you to the 28th Crit Cross that we've been organizing since almost 10 years, 9 years now. Thank you, Depot, for the long cooperation that we've been having. Thank you also Frida and Roseanne for joining us tonight here, and I would also like to thank to our sponsors. It's the City of Vienna and the 7th District Neubau. So thank you very much and enjoy the evening.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah, also online. Is the PowerPoint seen online too? Okay, great. Yeah, I'll just get started. Thanks so much for the invitation, both Verein K and Depot, and for everyone working with all the levels of production. Thanks, Roseanne, for being part, and for the people who want to listen. I'll get started. So I'll present what I call the Dropout Subjects, a preliminary account. And I'll start with this image, which I stumbled on a facade in central Rome last year. And the hashtag that we see in the bottom of the picture, Scelgo la vita, says in English, I choose life. And pro vita, in English, pro-life, is part of the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni's campaign against abortion, as part of which feminized people, trans people, and migrants are repressed. And I'm showing this image as this is where my writing that I will present tonight both starts and ends. In a historic moment when many social rights struggled for during the post-war era are threatened or lost, while an increasing amount of people globally are asking to what extent rights can be regained within a system that allows genocides to happen. So when Italy's first separatist, anti-authoritarian and decentralized feminist group, Rivolte Femminile, was founded in Milan in 1970, abortion was still illegal in the country. It was this illegalization was serving to preserve the white supremacy of the population in times of crisis since Mussolini. Criminalizing abortion was therefore a way to force native Italians to give birth, since rape and sexual violence was free of choice within the nuclear family structure. And Rivolte Femminile was assembling against this forced procreation upheld by the relation between the patriarchal breadwinner family and the nation state. And along with a growing autonomous and feminist movement during this period, Rivolta argued against a legalization of abortion, since their trust in the state was minimal. And I will soon explain how they argued against it. So writing the history of the Italian feminist movement from within in 1977, the Milan Women's Bookstore Collective cites the French mystic, philosopher and political thinker Simone Weil, who once wrote in one of her notebooks, "Don't think that you have any rights." And in continuation with the group's reference to Weil, Italian political scientist Paola Stellifieri has recently underscored that the question is whose victory a legalization of abortion would have implied in the 1970s. That abortion was legalized in Italy in 1978 was considered by many feminists a failure, and I will explain why. So in Rivolte Femminile's collective text, Female Sexuality and Abortion, the only one which they presented in public for the occasion of the first meeting of the Italian feminist movement in the summer of 1971, they defined legalized abortion as a further development of the oppression of feminized people. And they write, liberalization of abortion has become, through millennia, the condition by which the patriarchy intends to remedy its conditions while keeping the terms of its domination unaltered. So in brief, Rivolte Femminile and many other feminists in the early 70s were arguing for the right to abort, but they were against the struggle for a right given by the state. So this is the crucial difference. But I will jump ahead. So in focus for this project and what I will present tonight is feminist dropouts from art criticism to sexual liberation, and what I want to I want to underscore the relevance of these in relation to our current moment. So the dropouts from art criticism, that Carla Lonzi, co-founder of Rivolte Femminile, and American radical lesbian Jill Johnston undertook in 1969 materialize what I call dropout subjects. Dropout subjects are by nature undefined and materialize gaps in given epistemological understandings of critical, political, and sexual subjectivities. In Lonzi's words, dropouts provide what she calls a cultural void. And describing the international feminist movement in 1972, Rivolte Femminile speaks of the birth of a feminist situation. Oh, here we have Jill Johnston and Carla Lonzi, I apologize. The birth of a feminist situation. Such a situation builds on and yet diverts from the situationist insistence on situations made to live by their constructors, to paraphrase Guy Debord's initial text on situationism from 1957. For Rivolte Femminile, the feminist situation was rather a matter of realizing the present in the name of those who have been historically stigmatized, such as feminized people. Such realization are not the same as constitutions or legal, political, or aesthetic representation. Rather, they are moments of self-abolition and simultaneous self-realization of the autoerotic subject. And in 1978, Lonzi describes this process as the pleasure of discovery, which escapes control and hence, I also suggest, surpasses both sexual, political, and cultural dialectics. Arguing for an autonomous feminine pleasure, Lonzi writes in another essay that, here we go. It is this I as a, it's because I'm used to another label of the computer without mentioning any of them. It is this I as a cultural void that forms the premise for a rediscovery of our bodies, i.e. of a culture that is ours. And in this regard, feminist consciousness raising is an erotic practice, and in Lonzi's words, it is the development of something that by definition escapes control and making them an asset, or assets. So to return to the dropout subjects, I use the notion of the dropout with obvious reference to American artist Lee Lozano and American feminist Valerie Solanas, who both complicated the idea of participation and dropping out. The dialectics of integration and dropouts was central to the conjuncture in question, in which people on the new left, as well as anarchists, feminists, artists, intellectuals, and hippies all gathered in movements of what German critical theorists Herbert Marcuse termed great refusals of post-war warfare, of genocide and incarceration. And in 1970, Lozano initiated her dropout piece and attempted to abandon the art world. In Solana's view, women were never in the first place, and therefore, as she argued, dropping out is not the solution, fucking up is. But Jill Johnston and Carla Lonzi, who both were influenced by Solana's manifesto, were in, at least partially. They were art critics, and they published frequently. They traveled and were friends with some of the time's most influential artists. They both had university education, and Lonzi also came from a petit bourgeois family. And still, during their time as critics, none of them came out before 1970. And in a comment shortly after the Stonewall riots in 1969, Johnston admits, "I didn't really want to make a trouble for myself. Nobody ever gave me reason to believe that I would be adored and acclaimed for loving my own sex." Both Johnston and Lonzi came out as separatists and lesbian 1 year after which both of them had abandoned art criticism. And with that abandonment, they also abandoned the nuclear family, political identities, and academic science. And the conditioned freedom that they had experienced as art critics constitutes what I defined as a double character of the critic. And to explain that very briefly, just like labor and the modern artwork for Karl Marx and Theodor Adorno, the petit bourgeois for T.J. Clarke, and the found objects in John Roberts' reading of Duchamp, and the performer for Adrian Piper, this character is double, at once autonomous and socially determined. So what distinguishes Jill Johnston and Carla Lonzi from most American and Italian art critics at the time is that they increasingly reflected their sexuality and desires in writing. And they did so by turning to a romantic practice of self-criticism, which during this period had a revival in minimalist, conceptual, and informal art practices. And in the mid-60s, Johnston and Lonzi began to adapt these techniques, these artistic methods, to themselves. So instead of functionally transforming artworks from the point of view of the critic, as artists at the time did from their point of view, Lonzi and Johnston rather employed artistic techniques to refunction their own subjectivities as art critics and sexual subjects. So I will explain this a little bit more, that I think that the use of artistic methods without an artistic outcome is definitely comparable to activities within the late avant-garde movement, such as surrealist and especially situationist actions and forms of writing. But the difference is that while the centrality of sexuality was lost after surrealism and transposed from art to politics in the late 60s, it had a central role in Johnston's and Lonzi's adaptations of these methods in the late 60s and all the way to 69 onwards. And I think that artistic practice for them functioned as a placeholder for the coming into being of the dropout subjects. Yeah. So I will say a little bit about these dropout techniques that they employed, about the placeholders. And Lonzi, on the first hand, published a book in the fall of 1969, the title of which, Autoritratto, or Self-Portrait, currently available in great English translation by Alessandro Maldonado. It refers to artistic self-reflection in the most general sense, or the title does. And this book was, in brief, a montage of several individual interviews that Lonzi had conducted with 14 Italian artists since 1964, edited during 68-69 in the form of an imaginary group conversation. And on a practical level, this book was a way for Lonzi to outsource her critical subjectivity to the artist's self-reflective practice. So rather than self-reflecting her own subjectivity, she let artists discuss the role of the critic as they found it, and many of them found the critic to be quite useless. They suggest that artists can be critics instead, as many did at the time. On the other side of the Atlantic, in May 1969, Jill Johnston arranges a panel discussion around herself as a critic, in which she barely spoke herself. And the panel was titled The Disintegration of a Critic. And in her press release for this panel, she called for autobiographical writing, a genre that she cultivated increasingly since. And in both these cases that I think are relatable, Lonzi and Johnston joined established artists and critics such as Andy Warhol, Lucio Fontana, Gregory Batcock, and Carla in conversation about the relation between the art critic and social crisis. And both the book and the panel, which of course are very different, but they both make clear that the form of the panel and the artist interview transformed into more fictional conversations in live or transcribed montage format were ways for Johnston and Lonzi to reflect their own subjectivity beyond that of the art critic. And in brief, it was their exodus. So I suggest that this book and this panel marked what I think of as Lonzi's and Johnston's dropouts, which according to my understanding was a process lasting between 1969 and 1970. And during this process, Lonzi and Johnston replaced the artist's subject and acted in the experimental placeholder practice that I just described with the lesbian and separatist feminist subject. So doing so, they also abandoned the individual practice of the art critic and artistic critique alike. And rather, they endorsed a heterogeneous practice of sexual liberation. But importantly, rather than refusing or striving for the abolition of art or politics, as many did at the time, Johnston and Lonzi inherently abandoned given conditions for subjectivation within the discourse of the avant-garde itself. So by way of withdrawing, they initiated processes of disintegration and deculturalization, which are notions they themselves introduced to name the dropouts. And I will soon explain what I mean with this. But first, I would like to kind of situate this discussion a little bit. And I do, with this work, diverge from existing discussions in which Johnston's and Lonzi's turn from art criticism to feminism is understood in line with the discourse of the self-ascribed end of art history or art criticism. These were our discussions which were initiated by the more conservative critics at the time, such as Lonzi's nemesis Giulio Carlo Argan, also in 1969. And rather than adhering to that, I want to show how Johnston and Lonzi employ artistic means to refunction their art criticism as social critique of the subjectivities that both art and politics historically assume. So Johnston's and Lonzi's 1969 dropouts, therefore, I think, serve as a lens through which this social critique can be studied and understood. And I think central to this discussion is their use of social and technical means, from performance to recordings, transcriptions, and montage practices, which is common for both examples. And I think in this discussion it's important to both build on, but at the same time question existing research in late avant-garde practices and feminist historiographies. And central to those fields are the role of art after 1968 and the emergence of second-wave feminism in the early 70s, respectively. I mean, to refer to canonized categories or fields. But way too few investigate these two processes in tandem. And importantly, I think Johnston and Lonzi are different from other figures in the global avant-garde and second-wave feminist movement in the way in which they abandoned the given conditions for subjectivation rather than striving for new ones, be it a revolutionary subject, a new form of womanhood, or a new artistic or political form of representation. Rather abandoning this kind of strival, Lonzi and Johnston actually underscored the gendered absence that such strivals actually reproduce, also within feminism itself. And, you know, from the present, we know that the second wave feminist movement was definitely not inclusive. And I'll get back to that. I think that Johnston's and Lonzi's dropouts articulate the very experience of this absence from that point of view and from that period and context. And I think in this absence, in that gap, which Lonzi and Johnston put into practice in social montages and across the field of art and feminism. And Lonzi called this practice the materialization of the unexpected or unforeseen, depending on how we translate. For Johnston, it was rather a performance. And the further into the 1970s we reach, these montages became increasingly autoerotic, and Johnston's and Lonzi's arguments also centered increasingly on sexual subjectivation and desire. And bringing attention to this development, we can gain, I think, new understandings, not only of art critical, but also political and sexual subjectivity in that period. Yeah, so. Johnston's and Lonzi's 1969 dropouts, I think, they did take place in a moment of history which have already been quite big, like discussed quite a lot when it comes to art, politics, and sexuality in the aftermath of '68, both in the US and in Italy. And in very brief terms, it was a time when social movements and forms of practices both grew and disintegrated in parallel. And this transformation of art criticism as social critique, as shown in the dropouts, I think must be is an important stone in that architecture, which I think it helps, at least it has helped me to understand the radical shift in art and sexuality that occurred after '68. And therefore, rather than understanding Johnston and Lonzi as art critics who became feminists, I rather want to kind of highlight the dropouts in '69 as the critical gap between both forms of subjectivities, both the subject of the art critic and the subject of the feminist. And that gap, I think, and the dropout, throws both into question, and I think that is urgent as ever today. So I think it allows for a categorical self-critique of the art critic, which former studies on the great refusals of the 60s and 70s have overlooked. So Johnston's and Lonzi's dropouts, as I already said, materialized in Autoritratto, Self-Portrait, the book, and in Johnston's Disintegration panel. It coincided with the culmination of a moment where a high conjuncture in the Western countries' post-war economic boom was about to tip over and started to slide into crisis. And economic historians such as Giovanni Arrighi would suggest this conjunctural shift was not only an economic one, it also implied a social and cultural crisis. So what is then the actual relation between art criticism and crisis in 1969? As Stuart Hall argues, history moves from one conjuncture to another rather than being an evolutionary flow. And what drives it forward is usually crisis. I want to suggest that we include the history of art criticism and its relation to crisis in this kind of conjunctural analysis of the movement of potential change that Arrighi describes as the great shift of 1969, and which occurred simultaneously as the dropouts. I understand this shift in relation to several crises that emerged in the late 60s. Crisis in Marxism and critical theory, crisis in art history, in communist organizing, crisis in artistic practice, crisis in feminism, to only mention a few. In this way, I argue dialectically that the broader social crisis of the late 60s also manifested itself in art criticism, and most dramatically in Johnston's and Lonzi's abandonment of art criticism. So in this sense, I want to suggest that the quote-unquote humanist subjects, such as the citizen, the academic, or the art critic, staves off crisis by operating as an administrator of the unholy alliance between imperial, colonial politics and liberal humanist ideals. So rather than retreating to the formalist and reductive argument that art criticism is in crisis, which has been circulated since '69, as I said, I want to underscore the centrality of crisis in all forms of social change. All the way back to Oscar Wilde's play, The Critic as Artist, from 1891, this crisis is neither that of the art object nor of the critical reflection, but of the relation between the art critic and the social context of their practice. This also applies to the academic, like myself, etc. So, for example, Johnston's and Lonzi's dropouts show how it's not possible, I think, to discuss crisis and critique without also considering the changing role of gender and sexuality. And in her essay, Criticism is Power, from 1970, Lonzi describes the crisis as immanent to the critic's self-image. She writes, "So nothing and no one can throw this critic into crisis, who is incapable of noticing that our crisis is precisely our critique of the mandate assigned by us by a society or culture in the service of power." So there is more to say about this relation between critique and crisis in that moment, and building on Lonzi's contemporary Manfredo Tafuri's famous argument that there is no criticism, only history, Gail Day suggests that criticism then needs to throw itself into crisis along with the object. And in retrospect, Marco Biraghi has proposed that the subject undertaking critique during this precise period was an agent of crisis. And indeed, I think in the late 60s and the early 70s, we saw a conjuncture in which the political and philosophical idea of subjectivity and history was in crisis. And this was a crisis that Johnston and Lonzi refused to adapt to, and they refused to stave off that crisis, and rather dropped out. So, to understand Johnston's and Lonzi's abandonment of the art critical subject and their simultaneous actualization of their sexual subjects, I turn to the notion of refunctioning, which was conceived by Bertolt Brecht and theorized by Walter Benjamin. And Benjamin, in turn, also draws on German historian Robert Eisler, and he writes, Benjamin, "The task, therefore, consists of an unfunctioning of the form of the concert that had to fulfill two conditions. It had to eliminate the antithesis, first, between the performers and listeners, and second, between technique and content." And following this statement, Benjamin also adds that the task of changing the concert is impossible without the collaboration of the word. I think such collaborations can be understood broadly as forms of collective writing, editing, and publishing. I also think that these forms recall what Benjamin also describes as a new form of political meeting, which in turn enables new forms of political subjects. And in this work that I present today, I expand on Benjamin's use of refunctioning as a way of thinking of subjectivity as neither abolished nor reformed, but radically reformulated. And as Lonzi put it herself in Autoritratto, the form of writing that she undertook when retranscribing and re-editing the 14 artist interviews was a matter of fact, a matter of finding what she described as a page that isn't a written page. I understand Lonzi's strive to find this unwritten page as a question of searching for another form of subjectivity, not only in the term of the critic's subject, but also, or the author's social form, but also the social form of critique altogether. And if Benjamin suggested a collaboration of the word, Lonzi's and Johnston's dropouts, their dropout subjects, I think, actualize the expression of a not yet individuated experience. And in this way, I think they did not reform their art criticism within the context of art, but rather aimed at, as Lonzi put it in 1970, to move to another plane. And as Mikkel Bolt Rasmussen has described, the paradigm of cultural studies within which this is kind of conceived resulted in a culturalization of critique. He also describes this he describes this as a process in which culture was detached from economy and capitalism. And I think so simply critique of culture was detached from the critique of capital. And I think there is no coincidence that the notion of deculturalization, which Lonzi used, was circulating in the French and Italian landscape in the 60s and the 70s, was used to articulate European, the coloniality of European post-war culture. And Lonzi made deculturalization the name of a dropout from art criticism by precisely refusing the culturalization of feminized subjects. And I think this exemplifies a moment in history from Frantz Fanon, who also used deculturalization in 1959, to Lonzi and Johnston's 1970s, in which a radical critique of culture was taking form, but which was halted somehow by the changing conjuncture. Today, when so many circumstances relate to the 1970s in many different ways, I think the question of what a social critique could imply is urgent as ever. So now I will just go briefly discuss these two terms introduced by Lonzi and Johnston. So firstly, Johnston's use of disintegration first emerged during a preparatory discussion for her panel performance, which took place 1 year prior to her disintegration panel. And it was one of the performers, an artist called Barbara Lloyd, who suggested a panel format in which a non-choreographed exchange of panel members and audience on and around stage should be initiated. So Johnston was redeploying the notion of disintegration in the press release for her disintegration panel, and somehow prepared for the same exchange to take place between her critical and sexual subjectivity. I think also that disintegration actualizes how Johnston pushed the contradictions between criticism and eroticism all the way to their limit. And this is clear in her description of her weekly columns in the countercultural journal Village Voice, which she contributed to throughout the 60s and into the 70s. And in 1970, Johnston wrote, "Gradually the life became the theater, became the column, the life being everything, of course, including everything." And in a retrospective note from 93, Johnston describes this process as a way of displacing the art object with writings about myself. So rather than replacing art with sexuality, Johnston emphasized the role of sexuality within art and furthermore as art. I think therefore that sexuality can be understood through the lens of art theory, in which the aesthetic categories, as suggested by Leo Steinberg in 1971, no longer hold. And in Susan Buckmore's words, Adorno's model of negative dialectics disintegrates the bourgeois idealist commodity form of philosophy. And as art critic and mediator of bourgeois ideals, Johnston's disintegration of the critic developed in a negative dialectical vein by means of its at once self-objectifying and emancipatory character. So in short, I think it was an autoerotic practice. And it made her becoming a figurehead within the lesbian movement, as many may know already. So let's turn to Lonzi. Lonzi was using the term deculturalization. This use has an intellectual history of its own, which is way too long to discuss properly tonight, but in brief, it was introduced in her first feminist essay, the well-known Sputiamo su Hegel, or Let's Spit on Hegel, from 1970. And here she describes the feminist practice of consciousness raising as deculturalization. And in the context of the dropout, it is so important to understand the relation between her use of deculturalization and the Italian notion of decultura, which means unculture or anti-art. Decultura is today quite overseen notion, but it was very central to the late avant-garde Italian discourse, in which Lonzi's art criticism played a key role. Moreover, there are also interesting relations between decultura, poverismo, arte povera, and the French surrealist thinker Georges Bataille's notion of informe, which dates back to 1929. I think that if Bataille's informe, the formless, was a question of challenging the subject's dialectical thinking, Lonzi's deculturalization was a matter of withdrawing from the reproduction of such a subject. And also, Lonzi's use of the notion of deculturalization is important to understand in relation to another surrealist thinker, Benjamin. And in this case, I think that her use of the notion allows, at least me, to understand her interest in authenticity, which I understand as Lonzi's call for an anti-cultural or decultural practice in art. So I here transpose the notion of authentic as Benjamin used to describe it as the wearing out of tradition of the modern art object during technical reproduction in the 1930s to the context of 1970s feminist consciousness raising practices. And to explain that a little bit more, in Benjamin's analysis, the technical refunctioning of tradition, in other words, the disintegration of the authentic artwork, emerges as politics. Then what politics is another question that he also talks a lot about, that we also need to talk a lot about today. In any way, in light of Lonzi's refunctioning of the art critic's subject to a more, quote-unquote, authentic, unexpected one, as she describes it, I think this must be understood in terms of what she in 1980 called for as an autonomy from culture. So if, for Benjamin, the historical experience embedded in the work of art says less about the artwork and more about history, Lonzi transposes this practice from art to life. And the feminized subject's experience is therefore also, should be understood, I think, through this heterogeneous history in which she is part, or that's kind of Lonzi's point of view. And this is the collective consciousness raising practice of deculturalization. And for Lonzi then, deculturalization means to abandon not only criticism, but also art as we know it. But this was not a shared value within her group or collective, Rivolte Femminile. And I will say a little bit about that. Already in 1973, disagreements about the feminist relation to the art world emerged within Rivolta, which Lonzi co-founded with journalist Elvira Banotti and artist Carla. And this year, Lonzi wrote a poem which was only published later as part of her diary to her friend and co-founder of Rivolta Femminile, Carla Cardi. She wrote, "Art has saved you, not liberated you." I think she's probably right. But yeah, with these words, Lonzi broke up with Accardi. Like the poem concludes that they can't be friends anymore. So it's quite rude. Yeah, it's quite, she goes all the way. And already here we see the different outcomes of Lonzi's and Johnston's dropouts. Because for Johnston, what she describes as the art of writing, as she put it in 1964, that was just enough. But for Lonzi, it was the central problem. So I will try to come to almost get to my conclusion. And so, as already mentioned, I think we are now in a historic moment when the so-called rights gained during the post-war era are again threatened or lost. And in the spring of 2025, a former member of the currently active Italian autonomous network, Non Una di Meno, told me that perhaps it's time for the world's longest movement of autonomous feminism to die. And this person was referencing the increasing reactionary pro-life movements upsurging in Italy and beyond, whose cultural policy and propaganda so strongly have swamped the Italian landscape that the operativeness of anti-parliamentarism and autonomous feminist movements has been really put to the test. And today's, of course, we know that these issues arise everywhere. But if we just stick to Italy for now, in a discussion with another about the state of Italian autonomous feminism, then in which the notion of the woman is in a much needed crisis, I think, another former member of the same network critiqued the lack of change in the movement, since it does not take any stance against liberal feminism. And as a consequence of holding on to a 1970s separatist definition that is based on an essentialist understanding of gender and sexuality, the movement leaves trans people aside. And in contrast, this person added, it's very strange. Well, anyhow, the trans feminist context is changing all the time. So what I want to show tonight is that what the cultural void that Lonzi described it as, or the critical gap that these dropouts activated, I think was precisely the kind of constant change that this former Non Una di Meno member describes, or a pleasure of discovery, to use Lonzi's formulation. And I think it is in this sense that some of Johnston's and Lonzi's arguments articulated in the short period of the late 60s and the early 1970s reflect the social crisis that we are in today. And despite some of the outdatedness of some of their vocabulary regarding art, sexuality, and gender, there's the struggle against restricting forms of subjectivation, I think, opened up for a vocabulary that remains an activation, as Lonzi put it, for later forms of subjectivities and discourses until this day. So during a rereading of Lonzi's writing in the heydays of Non Una di Meno's struggle against Meloni in November 2023, Lonzi's 1970s critique of the post-fascist state sexual politics was read in a new light. It was read within an emerging crisis and paradigm shift that we are still in the middle of. In 1970, Lonzi wrote, "Let's not forget that family and security is the slogan of fascism." Yeah. Okay, yeah. So what about the dropouts then? Importantly, I think that to some extent, failed sexual autonomy of the 1970s can be understood in parallel to some extent, failed abolition of art by the avant-garde after '68. But also, I think something happened in '69 when artification, introduced by Adorno, was used as a means with another end. So in contrast to the process that Adorno describes as de-artification, so in very brief, this is the process in which non-art tests the form of art by intervening into its universality, while occasionally also being subsumed as art. anyhow. So in contrast to that process, Johnston and Lonzi rather used artistic technique to transform art criticism into something else. So in opposition to the pessimistic perspective regarding the artification of non-art, Johnston's and Lonzi's parallel notions of disintegration and deculturalization, coined in the very same moment as Adorno's late writings on these matter, highlight an erotic understanding of these processes. And Johnston's friend and colleague, artist and critic Gregory Batcock, his term criticism, which Jennifer Sickel has discussed more in a fantastic essay in Selva, for those who want to read more. So he introduces the term criticism, but also the term highlights Johnston, introduces the term anti-criticism to describe Jill Johnston's Dropout. And I think both of these terms, criticism and anti-criticism, proves quite useful. And if the dialectics of de-artification is Adorno's way of describing something akin to the culturalization of anti-art, then I think deculturalization is Lonzi's way to rather staying outside of, and if necessary also unlearn such cultural dialectics. Johnston rather advanced forms, I think, of autoerotic sabotage that shed a critical light on processes of culturalization and also made them more or less impossible. So they had different strategies. But in general, the dialectics of culturalization and deculturalization proceeds as, I think, the cycle of crisis of meaning that proceed under capitalism all the time, also then. And as the comment of the former Non Una di Meno member that I just cited, we may see new manifestations for which we have no categories with which to recognize. But I think this discussion also about Johnston's and Lonzi's dropouts also shows that not having such categories may be a necessary condition for something to happen at all. And this is my conclusion. Johnston and Lonzi, I think they offer an example of what Michel Foucault, in direct continuation of this period of the dropouts in 1982, suggested that we have to promote new forms of subjectivity through the refusal of this kind of individuality, which has been imposed on us for several centuries. And as this argument reads, subjectivity emerges from refusal, rather than being mobilized as a refusal. And I think this distinction is crucial. As Lonzi argues in Spugiamo su Hegel, dropouts imply the desire not to be studied. And obviously this causes a theoretical and political problem for anyone, also for myself. But it was also a problem for Johnston and Lonzi themselves, when they tried to redefine the space that the dropouts provided as methods for consciousness raising against new forms of feminism or in imagined alliance with other dropout subjects, which of course did not really work. And this is not only a historical fact, I think, but also methodological, which we need to kind of include in any critical discussions on this topic. I think that dropouts are contradictions. And I think this is seen in the way that the dropouts until this day have been redefined or refunctioned quite counterintuitively as formalized paradigms in art and feminism. And I here think that the curator and the liberal feminist, exemplified in figures such as Chris Kraus, for example, failed to respond to the categorical questions that Johnston and Lonzi posed in '69. So I think that Johnston's and Lonzi's dropout emerged as social critiques in the way of cutting through art criticism, the nuclear family, and the conditions for labor and artistic production, respectively. And this allowed for critiques of the crisis of these phenomena by precisely avoiding to adhere to any of these crises. And I think that they therefore clarify. Why is this not working? Okay, let's just go back. I apologize for the PowerPoint. They therefore clarify Manfredo Tafuri's argument that the subject of criticism is human civilization. But also I think what this material, which ranges from sexual dissidence in the US to the role of the notion of the subaltern in the wake of Italian autonomous feminism in the 1970s shows is that civilization itself is based on what Lonzi describes as compulsory identification. And it is also the reason why Johnston disregards non-separatist activities, which she describes as a political cop-out rather than drop-out. Johnston's and Lonzi's dropout subjects, I think, realize the refusal to adapt to the civilizing aspect of art and politics, and they rather manifestly speak otherwise, although in entirely different ways. And in Fred Moten's sense, I think that the dropouts speak beyond given forms of representation, which at once amounts to a critique of these forms, and at the same time constitute a paradox for the institutionalized critique thereof. Also, the kind of institutionalized critique I provide tonight. So highlighting the paradox of this talk itself, I would like to underscore how we not only can use, I think, critical cultural theory as a way to approach the dropout subjects in 1969, but we also need the dropout subjects to approach such theory and refunction it along the way. And with those words, I will conclude. In the words of the conceptual artist Claire Fontaine, whose definition human strike builds on Lonzi's deculturalization, these processes are already happening. They are happening all the time. And in a similar vein, I think that Johnston's and Lonzi's social critiques of art criticism and sexual forms of subjectivation continue to resonate in our present day. The question is also how to critically discuss this resonance. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frida, for this very rich talk. So I think it's great to maybe just begin by drawing or like coming back, because at the end you were kind of like pointing towards some of the ways of refunctioning these former withdrawals for the present. So I was thinking maybe we could start by thinking a little bit about or just by kind of like looking at the present in light of your work on this history, and thinking about what kinds of forms of withdrawal exist today, and also potentially like if we can link that with a kind of maybe a diagnosis of the social crisis today. So I was thinking, obviously we're seeing a lot of, like you mentioned, the conjugal or the nuclear family and security as these kind of fascist forms that Lonzi was diagnosing in her like post-fascist or not defascistized society, and that's kind of like become more prominent or visible to us today. But we're also seeing, as you said at the beginning, genocide, intensification of war, also like forms of depression. But yeah, I would be interested to hear like what is your analysis or diagnosis of the present in relation to this historical work?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think this is, of course, something that should not only be diagnosed by me, but I think what this material kind of sheds light on or allows us to notice, allows me to see in a different light is I guess what I learned from this project is to understand the relation between crisis and change, and that, which I guess I also talked a little bit about. So I mean that change can mean many things. And for example, refunctioning, this kind of quite famous term that Benjamin and initially Brecht were like discussing, is often used in a more like context of radical leftist practices, but it can of course also just have a very opposite direction. So all these kinds of what I call techniques can have different effects given the context in which they are used. And that's, I think, for me, really important to kind of remember when, if we look back at something, we need to remember it had a specific effect in a specific context, but it would perhaps have another effect in another context. So in the present context, abandonments and dropouts have different shapes. I think already in the 70s, I mean, someone who could also be included in this discussion, but who engaged less with art criticism in particular, is Shulamit Firestone, who in a footnote in her book, The Dialectics of Sex, also critiques or goes in dialogue with Solanas and writes, dropout, I mean, now I'm citing, like, spontaneously citing or unciting, dropouts are inefficient and they are also reactionary. I mean, you can, and she writes, you can of course just move and live on an island and hope you won't be bombed by someone. And then she's meaning, of course, the test bombing then, which we also see today. So, and I think that she's very right. That's one way to see it. I think it's necessary to discuss the conditions of withdrawals, but also the effect. And this was definitely a moment in which the radical abandonment or the great refusal was quite strongly practiced across, across the US with Marcuse, and then we had the German critical theorists who went down to Italy, and via and this kind of transportation of ideas that was quite fast, although they didn't have the internet of refusals, which we today, many people are talking about it today too, that we have these forms of non-formalized movements of refusal from endnotes to Mikkel Bolt Rasmussen. But which I appreciate all their work, what is also missing, I guess, is the conditions for refusal. And I think often these discussions are are sometimes including perhaps Black Power, the legacy of the Black Power movement, but less the role of sexual liberation, which I think, I mean, the relation between colonial emancipation and how the kind of, as Fanon speaks about it, as a kind of dialectics of deculturalization and culturalization, you kind of, as a colonized subject, you experience both all the time. And that was transposed to feminist discussions by Lonzi and others. And it is dialectical, so you also need to understand any kind of abandonment. Dialectically, you may leave something, but you enter something else. And this was the fact then, it's also the fact now. When it comes to boycotts or unplanned disappearances that takes place because of life circumstances, I guess one thing is to discuss the conditions for these, and another one is to discuss their representation, kind of. So that's, I guess, what I spoke of as the paradox of the dropout. But I didn't really get to the diagnosis. But perhaps we can, if you have, would like to build on that question a little bit, or I can also just keep talking. But it would be nice to hear you as well.
Yeah, I think. I think the work kind of evokes a lot of
or it kind of like, for me, because I think I also like came across Carla Lonzi like in 2011 or something, and then started to go into it, but I'm not a specialist. And obviously looking at this structure of what you call like a radical refusal or abandonment or withdrawal, it's like, for me, I think the questions arise, the questions that arise, like, really linked to what you described as this kind of paradox of leaving something and entering something else. Or I think for me, there's also this question of the political visibility, or in a time right now, which you also pointed to, where like our rights are being eroded and the right is very strong, and we're in a period of like fascistization. What is the political efficacy of withdrawal or dropping out? Yeah. And I think this is like and in relation to art criticism, like, does it, like, some of us went to Venice recently, and what would it have meant if we didn't go to Venice? Or what, potentially nothing. But like, but also, I think the question for me, as someone who tries to take a position on things, or like participate in a way, or act in ways that have effects, the radicality of simply withdrawing and abandoning everything is like a risk that is too great for me to take. It would be like I would be on the side of Firestone. Yeah. And I think, but maybe that like leaves me in the realm of culture, and not on the side of like deculturalization. And so I'm just kind of interested in the kind of like efficacy of this, what is at stake in this today, or like what can we learn from it? Yeah. And so I guess the maybe also even as an art critic, like what would it even look like?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question, and I think if we look back at history, it did have a huge impact. That I mean, when it comes to Lonzi, for example, that kind of big gesture started a huge erosion in society, and which all the way up to today threatens Meloni. So somehow it did have an effect, but the thing is that capitalist society learns from its enemies and kind of starts to repeat those gestures turned against it, and it just looks different. So on the one hand, I'm still one of the people who would undersign the relevance of because I think what is central, for example, in Lonzi's, in this very, very complex refusal of a legalized abortion law, which was, common to I mean, it was not only a revolt feminile, it is a refusal of the state. And I think we definitely, now I live in a Scandinavian social democracy, and I think there is too much belief in the state still. This is starting to change in many, many countries. I mean, belief from a kind of proto-leftist, whatever, centrist position. And I think that kind of huge disbelief in the state and like the refusal to collaborate with the state is super important. But then at the same time, we know all the history of the institutionalization of institutional critique, and what I've spoke about with Adorno and all of that in the talk. So the question is, to what extent can that refusal stay outside? What I tried to say here is that there was just a brief moment that something could have happened that was perhaps even more radical than it was, but it just it was a small spur. Perhaps we can cause a small spur today, but when it comes to like being an art critic today, I guess I'm double. I think there is an interesting way of understanding the dropout as a critical gesture in itself, because it is a form of separation, and cultural boycotts are as well critical gestures. So there is also this necessity to redefine what is critique today, I think, not only asking how should critique be be practiced. And there I think we have many forms of critiquing that look different from what is today called art writing, since Jill Johnston introduced the art of criticism, as she said in '64. But then how are they represented? And that's, I guess, the paradox, as you mentioned. Like, if, for example, if you don't attend without expressing it, what is the point? There are also, of course, I think, again, returning to Fanon, who has the choice to choose to refuse inclusion. This is the kind of paradox that Lonzi caused when she imported this term to the context of feminism rather than anti-colonial liberation. She did speak of she described women as colonized, and she was not the only one. Everyone did, because they read Fanon. And today I think we are in just the very same we need the very same consciousness about that. So I think it's up to everyone to decide what they want to do, but there is always, so perhaps I can just make this small reference that I mentioned to you before, that Jill Johnston was also quite interested in this abandonment, although she didn't she didn't term it a dropout like I do. And she went to visit Agnes Martin, who had also abandoned art out in the desert, and she said, "You're also a lesbian woman, right?" And Agnes Martin says, "No, I'm not a woman, I'm a doorknob." And then and Johnston writes this because she writes everything, and I love that. I also want to be a doorknob. I mean, I also feel more related to a doorknob than the term woman, to be honest. But and then that's and then she also Johnston also describes in one of her texts on this fact that she was a little upset when she realized that Agnes Martin was constantly returning to New York and returning to kind of the art context and discussing prices of her work and so on. And then Agnes Martin describes to Johnston that as soon as I dropped out, I was found to be lost. So there is this kind of, you can only drop out if this is represented. And this is what these figures did, because they wrote, they made a panel, they made a book, and they kind of published all it happened in text. It was a technical gesture. I mean, there are many of these gestures that are not technical, that just happen, as you mentioned, from depression or from society's abandonment of people's capacity to survive. And then the discussion needs to be turned somewhere else, which I'm quite interesting today to turn more to, actually. In that sense, dropouts are not only from society, but also caused by society and a product of society.
Yeah, maybe that segs in an interesting way into another point, which is, I think because you're really interested in this historicization or this conjunctural analysis, and I guess you're talking about this moment of this a kind of, the welfare state and this post-Marshall Plan, U.S. and Western Europe context defined by the society essentially being rebuilt, and I think we've benefited from the work of Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who's given us the term organized abandonment, and we've lived through austerity, and I think I think maybe just to kind of think about these disanalogies potentially between that time and our time today. The withdrawal, or as you started to mention, people are not necessarily, or the agency of dropping out isn't necessarily the same potentially, and also dropping out of that, being like trying to enter the art world is something that people are like constantly endlessly pursuing, and to drop out from it, like no one is going to care very much. So so I think that these are some of the kinds of, I think for me, like interesting questions in relation to the dropout subjects, like or this paradigm that was opened up or given to us by Carla Lonzi and Jill Johnston, like, and in terms of like what we can learn from it today, in relation to this, like, I guess we saw during COVID this kind of like total abandonment of people to die, and now this kind of total adherence to a genocide and also, or like multiple genocides, and also like a kind of willingness to go into war and pour all of our resources into rearmament and so on. So maybe like I'd just be interested if you could maybe talk a little bit about these. Yeah, maybe you go back to your question of crisis and how you're thinking about this. Like the role of crisis and criticism, and what again, I think I'm really interested in what the agency or what the power of dropout is.
Thank you. I mean, there is a lot in this, and like first of all, I think there is something to think of in relation to crisis and criticism, and I'm not the first and not the last to say that, but I think I think critiquing the crisis is quite important, and I think one way of doing that is to refuse this, like, which art critics today may say, oh, our field is in crisis, but perhaps kind of it's actually a social crisis that we live through and that we actually can critique. So in fact, critique is strong as ever if we just use it in a way that is necessary to the context we live through. And one way, for example, is, for example, as we see ways to redefine the emphasis of art on like cultural practices to speak of fascist tendencies that many cultural platforms and theorists are doing today. And as I mentioned, I also think that the cultural boycott is quite interesting in the way that it is a kind of organized abandonment, but at the same time is it abandonment of the circulatory logics of whatever is abandoned in the context of it's like capitalist mode of production and circulation kind of, and how could we like extend that to not only boycott commodities or economic relations, institutionalized relations, but also, I guess this is where we can come to a question of what a social critique could mean for us today. That could be, of course, also today to, as I guess many of us are doing, redefining friendships based on the way we see the world today, which is radically changing. And so that's one thing. And when it comes to, could you remind me a little bit, because you said many things, but
Sorry.
But I think perhaps you said these things about these abandonments of like kind of enforced dropouts, and
or maybe just maybe other people also have something to add, but I guess it's just the question of the kind of how we can refunction this idea of withdrawal or deculturalization, or I'm not sure about disintegration, but like I think deculturalization is really, really interesting, and the ideas are really, really interesting and pertinent, and but I was just thinking, like, in our moment, in our historical moment, which seems really to be defined by, like, in Ruth Wilson Gilmore's words, like organized abandonment, the kind of not the disappearance of the state, because the state is taking on a different form, but but like this, I mean, the state isn't something that we can rely on in the way that the welfare state functioned. And so I'm obviously not advocating like defending the state or defending the state as a legitimating body, but just to try to think like how can we how can we understand, or what could we do to put this into practice? Like I'm really drawn to infrastructural critique, which I think is really loose and transversal and can be, it offers something, so we can use the state potentially. Yeah. And so it's not, so I think I think that's I guess that's like, but I don't know if you want to respond to that, but we could also...
Yeah, no, I can respond briefly. I think like infrastructural critique is really a term introduced by Marina Wischmidt, is really like pointing to that. She's also using the gap, so kind of the between, in and out. So it's really, and kind of insisting on the dialectics of that and how does it look, what is it materialist, like how is it materialized, and that's like I definitely agree. This is where we should. This is from where critique should depart. So a few things about because we're always all both inside and out. I mean that's how it looks like. Everything else would be very naive, but just in very different ways. You know. I mean, Fanon would also say we're also culturalized, but it's just like indigenous culture. So it's, very important to underscore that for him, deculturalization was the problem, and culturalization was both colonial but also indigenous at the same time. So yeah, that's very complex, and currently I'm trying to work more on that. But I'll say just briefly, I think what is interesting today is, for example, how I think this turn from art to perhaps sexual politics allows us today to think of potential. I think perhaps today dropouts from art, as you say, nobody would notice, or people are unwillingly dropping out from their jobs all the time because we see an unemployment and exhaustions and depressions and whatever. I mean, at the same time, I think what would a dropout from the nuclear family mean? What would a dropout from imagined sexual identities or legal identities look like? We still haven't gone enough. We still need to get further in that understanding. I mean, we in terms of whatever, all of us. And that's also an institution. All these terms or categories are institutions that, and some of them can be used against themselves. Some of them are more necessary to abandon. And then it depends on the time and context where and how we should provide that institution, that infrastructural critique, that dropout, or whatever we call it. And I think today, for example, when it comes to, you know, cultural genocide or turfism and transphobia, I think then abandonments of certain institutions may have huge impacts in other contexts. For example, the art context, as art critics that both you and I and some others in this room are, it may mean something to stick to the pen and write about what is actually happening, like write about the political questions that are around art, rather than, and insisting on that this is central to the works, to not only leave the publications we have left to people who would use it for a very other political means. So, yeah, that's perhaps. But in other contexts, that strategic representation may be too violent or not productive, but rather something to abandon. So it depends on the matter, and I think it's not only about art. And I think that the history of art is the history of sexual liberation and of anti-colonial liberation. So it's inseparable, kind of. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Frida. But like,
thank you.
Yeah, also wanted to ask: are there any questions or comments?
Is it possible to post questions online? No. Yes. Okay.
Oh,
yeah.
Great.
idea of what does it mean to drop out and who's going to notice. I mean, of course, this is an argument that we can think about, but also maybe sometimes it's actually really something to do on a personal level. So when I think about this, when I think about dropouts, I actually most of the time think of it as a personal act, and it really has a lot to do with the notion of the context. Because I think that, I mean, maybe also from myself, I think about this a lot, about this notion of the impossibility to grasp the context or to talk about the context in a way that does justice to it, and in a way that can be actually, this process can be, this context can be processed in a way that I want it to be processed, to see it being processed. So, okay, so what I mean
So
by
what
this,
context do you mean? Like the society we live in?
what does it mean to be a queer person? What does it mean to be a lesbian? What does it mean to be a woman? Right? Because being like the queer experience is a very individual experience, actually, not like the heteronormative mode of living that comes with a manual with it. Right? So every queer person has their own experience of being queer, and to bring this context. And I mean, now I'm just bringing this as an example. It could be also, what does it mean to be an Arab? What does it mean to be a Muslim today? And all of this. So to bring this context into another context, especially in this neoliberal art world that we have, is being all the time washed and rewashed into something that the person themselves, they feel very attacked by this actually all the time. So then you just decide maybe to make a cut and to stop talking about this. So it's also a moment of dropping out. And it's not for anyone to notice. It's really not to make a show or to make an announcement. It's just for you to take the decision, okay, I'm gonna now decide that I'm not going to talk about this because the context that I want to bring is impossible to bring, maybe, first. I don't know, maybe not. And second is because it's just being washed and rewashed through this neoliberal art world that we have today.
Thank you. I think this is really, like, what you touch upon is also, for example, how to refuse the idea that Israel is a queer-friendly place, and that kind of, to what extent can you, at what points is it possible to mobilize that refusal, and to in what other contexts would it be too harmful to activate that fact? And I think this is, I think in my social context where I am, what I talk with my friends about, that's a very central question. I mean, of course, also Israeli apartheid and genocide, but also in other institutions that have less to do with Israeli cultural funding or anything, but anyhow that are institutions that still operate on this dialectics of integration and I mean the kind of conditioned freedom that I described, that those back then felt like as supposedly heterosexual art critics who happened to be women, which was a little bit too much already then in the mid-60s. So how do we deal with our conditioned freedom today? And I think, again, it's a question of, I think what we haven't talked about is solidarity also, because it differs from everyone to who has the capacity to refuse a conditioned freedom for another more free, autonomous life. And so this is also why must this be based on an individual practice? And it is because of obvious reasons, because of the society we live in, but still, can that critique also allow for an extended form of, I don't know, solidarity, to make it super brief, but still, obviously, still too complicated for society to change. But I think that's just what I and it's a paradox too, because how can we we can't really practice freedoms for each other, but perhaps we can, do what we can do. I don't know. Do you have anything to say about this?
It was really a comment. Yeah. So just that if you have,
Do you want to say anything? Yeah. Another question. Yes.
Sort of question, but I have to admit, Frida, thank you first of all for this. That I'm trying to think through, a bit with what you proposed, and what you also said about the personal, because I feel some trouble with it, with this idea of the personal and how, what you also mentioned, like how do we fall back into a certain sense of individual identity, like while we try to transgress it, like what is the escape, what is the space beyond or outside behind it. But I was more thinking, because tracing somehow what you were saying, like I learned recently while researching reproduction from a different angle that the most valuable thing in contemporary capitalism, according to some people, is time and attention.
Could you repeat it?
That like the most valuable resource, that like we can offer and reproductive practices is time and attention. And I'm thinking about it in regards to this like dropping out in the arts, but generally like social relations, like what does it mean, how to negotiate this in terms of how to divest. I mean, I'm not saying anything new, but I'm just thinking like what are those strategies or tactics that actually allow us to at least like for a moment test or risk something, and what is this risk actually? Because also what you mentioned, Rosanne, like this like dropping out, like so this inclusion, like what is the sense of loss for whom, and if you are leaving or you're dropping out, where to? Because also you were talking about the void, in a different way, I think. But one thing that I just wanted to bring, and I wonder like if there's anything, because you mentioned very briefly like Simone Weil, and I actually think about this now in the resonance of like, and this maybe is also just relevant to me, like this kind of self-denial. What does it mean? In today's world, like this like refusal of also a certain self-reproduction, which, and I don't mean to romanticize, like her like what she was doing and advocating for, but also in terms of this kind of how to transgress this individual and this discursive frames. What would be this? That's my question. Like I wonder. It's a big question. No?
Thank you. I think I love it, and I think I agree. What I hear you say, I mean, is when it comes to Weil, which is not about her personal biography, but the fact that these kinds of self-denials or deculturalizations or auto-reductions can have this kind of anorectic individualization, like hyper-individualizing effects. And how can we avoid that? And I think perhaps when it comes to, I think what I see, if like not in terms of a critical, like my life practice, like a life practice that I see taking place around me, is that first of all, a refusal of an identity, for example, is done collectively, and secondly, I mean, I think the withdrawal from something is the entering into something else, and to avoid that void to be a black hole or homelessness or something in between, there is also the need of collectivizing that void. And I think it can be, I think we see this in student camps and in alternative medication systems and in free culture, but and the question is how we turn it. I think it's always both the refusal of something and the kind of subscription to something else. But I guess the question is where we position the self-critique or the infrastructural critique. Yeah. So, but we are in a moment when this kind of almost a little bit depressive, anti-reproductive, as Terry Tamlitz have this old essay or film and essay called Deproduction, which I also find useful. And we are in this moment, and like we want to stop, reproduce all these institutions, but still the only way to have a job, to have a home, to have food, is to kind of subscribe to any of them. At least one, hopefully two. Like either you have a family, as one friend told me, like either you have a family or a stable partner, stable house or housing or stable job. Like you should at least have two of those three, because if you don't have any of them, you can of course go to tons of biennials, but how long can you do that? And yeah, so yeah.
So to what you say, I'm also thinking of this like stepping out of nuclear family in the context of what you were researching. I'm also wondering, and it's an open question to me, how also conditions changed in terms of there's a certain discourse on choice, while it also kind of maybe obscures the profound change in conditions in which some people are already excluded, again, from access to those structures, no? Like, so I'm also wondering, what does it mean also in the contemporary context to, for instance, not only how the nuclear family transformed as an institution, but also like on what basis, also material basis, are we choosing or not choosing it? You know, like.
Yeah. I mean, when it comes to the nuclear family, which I think is as important in this kind of history, is as important to talk about as the art institution. I think Michelle O'Brien has written a lot about this and kind of really underscored how this kind of extended wage in the late 1800s, early 1900s, that kind of also was kind of early subsidies for housing or stuff like that we still know about. Perhaps the future generation will not know about it. It kind of forced, like it actually re-institutionalized the nuclear family even more, not only for the bourgeois, but also for the proletarian, and the family became that safety net. And it can also be for those who try to avoid cis heteronormal, like carceral racist society. Then an extent the term family can also be useful. So it's, I think, to make it. I think what I find useful is the way that Michelle O'Brien, in her book on family abolition, describes family as an institution in crisis, and the nuclear family. And I think this is true, and the question is how we critique that crisis, how we relate to it, do we want to buffer for that crisis, or do we want to talk about it, or do we want to, as Johnston and Lonzi did, as I said, avoid neither engaging nor helping out with it? And in what contexts? I think depending on a context we need to do different things. Also when it comes to that institution that is highly overdue in society. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question from the online.
Wow. Oh, it's a long one. Great. Who is it?
It's Jen Sichel.
Ah, fantastic.
I said your name right.
Yeah.
So Jen writes, thanks Frida for this really rich, smart, evocative presentation. I'm really interested in the difference you drew between Johnston's dropout as occurring within infrastructure within which it could be recognized as a dropout, and other forms of dropping out that are never recognized as such. And you mentioning that you're interested in turning your attention to the latter category. So I wonder if you could speak more about this turn in your work, which seems really, really urgent and vital.
Yeah, thank you, Jen. I think, yeah, this is, honestly, I think all of us, wherever we are in life, whatever history we have also experienced the involuntary dropout from something. I would like to spend more time on that. But I think, we can relate this to questions about trauma, about collective forms of therapy, alternative therapy and so on. But like, in brief, I think I'm curious why or whether we can use the... I don't think we can say that an involuntary dropout is a form of critique. Because critique is a practice that reproduces a certain subject, and the dropout is, or withdrawal, or kind of also abandons a certain subjectivity, as I said, and sometimes this is not conscious, sometimes this is not chosen. What I do find interesting is I don't think I'm the one to describe the kind of political role. I think there are many people who have made huge works on the role of depression and trauma and so on, but what I find interesting is to look at, which is something I've been bringing attention to parallel to this work, but in my private life, is to kind of study the practice of group therapy and how these forms of kind of physically like embodied gestalt forms of practices evolved in the very same time as these feminist methods of consciousness raising group practices. And it's interesting how both of these practices relate to history and something that is unspoken and what it means, or embodied or actualized, and what happens when it is then, whatever, collectively expressed or reflected between two or many figures. And I think this is that kind of resonance is what Lonzi described as the unexpected. And I think if we are to think of, and I'm really because I'm actually writing something on this now, but it's really not as developed as what I've presented tonight, is that if we want to kind of think that, for example, the involuntary dropouts that everyone to very different extents experience, from the experience in high school to genocide and everything in between, of those kinds of forms of societal exclusions or compulsions or whatever forms it may take. I think insisting on what happens in the kind of collectivization of that experience would, I think, allow for new forms, like forms of social critique that relate to, so we are now again back to a time when many of us go to therapy, not only in the Western countries. I had the chance to listen to a psychologist active in the West Bank at the moment and sharing her way of discussing trauma therapy, which was very interesting. And we are very much into this today by obvious reasons, but I think that practice can almost be as mobilized and remains to be as, for example, consciousness raising back in the days was mobilized for political means by some people. And I'm still curious to see how we can kind of envision those collective forms more broadly, and also perhaps allow it to be a way to abandon certain institutions actually for psychological assistance. I mean, perhaps to recenter those infrastructures as collective practice, which feels very urgent. Yeah. Thanks for the question. I think we should all think more about it, but yeah. Perhaps that's also a good point to, I don't know if you want to say anything more, or, yeah.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good, maybe it's a good point to end on this kind of, intention to think about how to think about the involuntary forms.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, because we will see more of them, I think. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Let's go to the bar, and thank you all for contributing, and see you soon.
Thanks for everyone. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks, Roseanne.